Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was assassinated and dozens of senior officials in Iran were killed. Fast forward, we're after a period of several weeks of bombardments, both from the US and Israel and from Iran across the region. On the 7th of April, a ceasefire was declared. Despite that ceasefire, Israel bombed Lebanon in one of the most intense attacks from Israel to Lebanon ever. Today, we're going to be discussing particularly some of the roots of this war, the reasons and some of the drives behind it. And I'm really, really, really pleased to be joined by Dr. Bamo Nouri. Welcome to the show, Bamo.
Thank you.
So you're a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of West London, and you wrote a book called Elite Theory and the 2003 Iraq operation by the United States. You've argued that basically the theory that you outline in there actually can quite neatly apply to this situation. So, you talk about in the book that the decision to invade in 2003 wasn't made purely by Bush or Cheney as individuals. It was made by a network of corporate elites who occupied the political offices and brought their interests in with them. In this latest war with Iran, Lockheed Martin's stock is up nearly 40% since the start of 2026, before the first bomb fell. The Pentagon signed a deal in January to quadruple what is called THAAD, so Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Interceptors, production from 96 to 400 a year at almost $13 million each. Trump met with the CEOs of RTX, Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, BAE, and many other arms manufacturers at the White House. And the Financial Times reports that the defense secretary's own broker tried to load up on defense stocks just before the war began. Of course, this is something that the defense secretary denies. So what I want to ask you is, who actually decided to go to war on Iran?
Well, on the face of it, you kind of look at the official reports. I mean, there's two versions of this. One is it was a joint U.S. Israeli operation, and there's kind of agreement strategically both between Israel and the U.S. to basically pursue escalations and to target Iran in that way. If you look at some of the recent reports, one that came out in New York Times, I mean, this is obviously bearing in mind that it's difficult to assess influential kind of elite networks in real time. It's always a lot easier afterwards. But you look at the recent New York Times report and you see that there was a meeting between Netanyahu and Trump in February, loads of presentations, arguments, evidence, Mossad intelligence that now was an appropriate time to strike and attack Iran. And basically, President Trump was on board with both the logistics and the logic of the timing and the approach to targeting Iran.
Well, I mean, in your research, you talk about corporate elites weren't infiltrating the government from outside, but they were the government. Cheney came from, Halliburton, Rumsfeld from Scala, the boards and the cabinets that were the same people. And, as you said, of course, it's a lot easier to assess things in retrospect, particularly actually in this war with such a high level of information warfare as well. And, we won't be talking about it much today, but, even with how, whether the Kurds will join this war or not has been discussed. Would you say that the Trump administration is even more openly an arrangement of corporate interests than Bush's was?
It's a very interesting question. And there's, if you kind of look up the build up to this administration in particular, so before Hegseth, during the Biden administration, it was Lloyd Austin, who was the Secretary of Defense for that term. Before his time as Secretary of Defense, he was sat on the board of Raytheon Technologies, which was part of the obviously groups that are making a lot of money right now in this conflict, but also historically always been a big defense contractor for the US. And of course, you had James Mattis, the 26th Secretary of Defense, moving from the Pentagon to another major defense contractor board. These aren't anomalies with the Bush administration. If you look at think tank influence, i.e., Heritage and the Make America Great Again think tank foundation, you see an America First policy and the promotion of American industry and the prioritization of American industry. I mean, whether you look at that from this move to not be the relied upon central authority in NATO and making NATO member states arm themselves individually and review their own security apparatus, who does that benefit? That benefits American defense contractors who then get larger than usual contracts from arming themselves. The other thing to consider at this particular point is coming back to the Assange argument that he made a long time ago, when he basically said the goal isn't to completely subjugate, when he was talking about Afghanistan, but the goal was to essentially use Afghanistan to wash money out of the taxpayers of the US, out of the taxpayers of European countries through Afghanistan and back into the hands of this transnational security elite. When you look at it this way, you then kind of start to see the picture of war beyond any sort of strategic win or defeat of the opponent, that there's a lot of money to be made in the short term, especially given how inflated some of these ammunitions are. I mean, you talked about THAAD, you talked about interceptors. When you look at the actual cost of these to actually deal with some of these much cheaper Iranian missiles and how much this is being consumed in real time, and this is, again, money going from the taxpayers in America, from the coffers there, directly into the pockets of arms companies to basically deal with this security and defense issue. So you've got the Make America Great Again kind of banner prominent in this administration through those foundations, and you see that their approach is slightly different. They're not thinking about occupying, but they are thinking about basically promoting the interests of domestic industry as much as possible.
So, I mean, it seems then the America First or the MAGA doctrine is more about American corporations first rather than the American people. Although, even that, even with the flaws of that, it actually, many people were convinced by the kind of Trump's America First doctrine because they assumed it meant the American people first. But actually, it seems like it's American corporations first, right?
Exactly. And this is the implication when the more you look at who benefits from this America First policy. I mean, Americans in this last month alone paid $8 billion more for petrol or for oil than they normally would. So even if you look at the implications of, let's say, an ongoing war with Iran, the Strait of Hormuz being closed, who's going to suffer? It's not just Americans with energy, it's going to be them food, massive consumer market, massive importer. You look at those kind of costs and you kind of start to see a different picture. Whilst in the same chaos or the same disorder, American corporations are having a field day, including oil firms. You look at the profits recorded, was it $130 billion again last month, energy companies that benefited from this conflict. And you start to kind of see a different corporate element. And the best way to look at the Trump administration is almost like comparing it to the Iraq War, when Dick Cheney was exposed for having shares in Halliburton. For as big and bold Dick Cheney was, there was an element of regret and remorse that he offloaded some shares. There was shame in publicly being known to be somebody who kind of partakes in these conflicts of interest or uses office to serve themselves or benefits directly. Yet we've seen under Trump a complete rebrand of the elite, kind of going from these older particular political class of men, the kind of usual stuff that you hear, the WASPs or the pale male stale, to this rebrand of the kind of tech bros, if you like. These guys, it was once hidden and almost hidden in plain sight for you to find these elite networks, something that I had to do for research. Oh, sorry. For my own research. But when you kind of look at then the way the inauguration ceremony in particular took place after Trump was elected, and you had all of these billionaires that were basically there, and those same billionaires, when you look at the Altmans, the Musks that then came and accompanied Trump on various state visits, including the one to the UK, you start to see that this is now no longer a hidden thing. This is part of the kind of order and what is accepted and the new norm. And it's the normalization existing corporate power as it starts to accumulate wealth at unprecedented speeds.
Yeah, and I mean, it really does seem, I've heard a few people also critically actually talk about how basically in the last few weeks, because they've had investments in, oil and similar industries, that they've made quite like hundreds of thousands of pounds. And so I think that's why it's important. Like, let's talk a bit more about the economics of this, because they are extraordinary. The war on Iran, as you said, is costing US taxpayers more than $1 billion a day. RTX, the parent company of Raytheon, entered the war with 268 billion order backlog. Lockheed signed a framework agreement to push PAC-3 missile production to 2,000 units a year. Israeli firms like Elbit are seeing share prices rise of 45%. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the European defense sector has rallied for years on the back of rearmament, and in Gaza, the same names, the same companies are arming the same campaign. One investment analyst described the greatest threat to investors in these firms as peace. And I think it's really important that we allow that to sit for a second. The greatest threat to a major sector of American economy is peace. So it really does seem like this is the opposite of, the so-called Trump doctrine of basically, which has already very clearly fallen, which is that, America first also means not having troops anywhere and therefore not getting involved in anyone else's wars, as Trump attempted to describe early on, both in his election campaign, but also early on in his presidency. There's also a Quincy Institute analyst who put it bluntly: war can be good for business. But if war is a business model, then ending war isn't, it seems like it actually no longer really is a moral or only a moral question. It's a structural one, because the structure depends on the war never ending. I mean, it sounds like a bit of a obvious question, but is war now the most profitable industry in the West?
One of them, when you kind of align it alongside big pharma and various other sectors, you start to see something that emerged in a research network that I was part of at London School of Economics and City, that was called Global Disorder Studies, that we should move away from looking at the world how we used to, that these are, the tenets of the order, this is what the order is. And when we have moments like Iraq or Afghanistan, we tended to turn around and say, well, they're anomalies within this order, and that the theory is still kind of law-based, international law-based, etc. When you look at this particular climate that we're in now, you actually see that this disorder, and this is what this kind of research network argued, that we should move away from looking at it as order and why it's not working, to disorder, and then what benefits from this continuous disorder. And one of those is obviously, as you touched upon, war and the economy of war. I mean, you look at the numbers. I wrote extensively about the 12-day war or aggression between Israel and Iran and the US last time. But this particular one is really interesting because some of the figures are coming out through the Pentagon, through briefings, and also the immediate real-time need to secure budget. So kind of let's be conservative and say it was costing $800 million, and the kind of minimum, and then around $1 billion per day on average, to $2 billion per day, depending on how intensity or how intensified, let's say, the missiles were coming in from Iran in a particular barrage. the early data suggests that just the first 100 hours of the conflict cost around $3.7 billion and 5.8 billion. So that's roughly around kind of $890 million per day. And the opening 24 hours around 779 million. So when you look at these figures, you kind of start to see, wait a minute, this is a hell of a lot of money. I mean, this becomes even more compelling when you start to compare it with the costs on the Iranian side, because this conflict also has a Cold War concern about it, right? At the moment, this is America and Israel, two strengthened militaries as part of this kind of liberal international order, which America's led since 1945. What would be the outcome if Iran came out on top or was able to survive? What has the world of security and defense learned? That actually these interceptors that cost exponential amounts of money and seem to be, going up in price yearly anyway, regardless of war, to how Iran is able to fight a war in such a kind of cheap rate. When you look at these Shahed drones that they're using, I mean, the lowest estimations are looking at around kind of $8,000 to $10,000 if you're kind of on the low side, and around 20 to 50,000 if you're kind of going on the more exaggerated costs. And now you start to see a way in of how Russia, under sanctions, under secondary and tertiary sanctions, has been able to fight a war with the Ukrainians for such a long time. What would this mean for our defense spending for somewhere like the UK if we're now starting to expose an industry that charges a hell of a lot of money for arms when there are cheaper ways of doing it? And this is the other kind of thing that's come into light as a result of this war. It's not just how expensive and how much of a market it is in the West, it's the alternatives that may exist out there from a defense point of view, especially given that somehow Iran has been able to survive this kind of onslaught as of late, and has been able to use its kind of missiles cheaply made strategically.
I mean, what is the reason for that discrepancy? Is it just that Western arms companies are just massively overcharging, or do the Iranians have a different set of innovations that are therefore able to, produce much cheaper, products? What's the reason for it?
Well, this is the $1 million question, right? Literally, when you look at this, so going back to the kind of Shahed drones that are used to not just as a part of a kind of defense apparatus, but they're actually used to then uh, deplete the Patriot interceptors, and they cost around $3.7 million to about $4 million, again, depending on market. Then the THAAD interceptor, which you referred to also before, costs around 10 to 13 million per launch. In the first 100 hours of the conflict, just the cost of interception was around 1.2 billion to $3.7 billion. So when you start to ask that question, what is it that makes it so expensive on the Western side and so cheaply made on the Iranian side? And what does that mean for the defense sector in an era where we're seeing budgets constantly being shortened and cut, and in some cases removed completely for state apparatus, for state structure, for healthcare, and we're seeing defense spending increase? I mean, this is where you start to kind of see that, wait a minute, there is not only a corporate collusion or benefit to this, these costs may actually be so far from what the actual cost of these things are. Maybe the profit margins of this sector has been left so uncontested for such a long period. I mean, the last book that I read on the arms industry was from 2007. And as you know, with the arms industry, in the name of defense and security and national security, there's very little that openly comes out. We're quite lucky to be in this era where we see a lot more real-time exposure of these things. But this sector has been almost unquestioned, I'd say, since the 1930s in terms of costs, purely based on the necessity, and the speed of that necessity or the demand outweighs that kind of space to basically say, wait a minute, can this be done cheaper. Instead, it's always been, this is the price if there's no war, and if a conflict does erupt and you need these things last minute, the price is going to go up exponentially.
Mm. I mean, yeah, I think, as you said, it's quite literally $1 million question, and I think probably deserves a lot more interrogation. But I will come back to that in a second. But I also wanted to talk about, if we think about Iran, Ukraine, Gaza, three different wars, three different framings, and a very different set of relations involved. But essentially the same handful of arms companies on the receiving end of every contract. Elbit shares are up because the world is watching their systems perform against, Iranian missiles, and essentially for them, war is a sales pitch. And, it seems like live battlefield performance for them is the world's most powerful marketing tool. Are these wars, if we think about Iran, Ukraine, Gaza, are these wars, connected? Or, yeah, are these wars connected? Are they the same war? Because we're also seeing, a ceasefire was declared. Israel then continued to attack Lebanon. Is part of this because literally just the use of arms? I mean, of course, it seems like there's, geopolitical and other considerations, particularly by the Israeli state. But yeah, are these wars connected? Are they the same war?
I think to put this as a kind of primary reason for the wars itself would probably not be the most accurate way to put it, but to kind of see that there is profitability and there is an incentive for continued war will be the best way to look at it. Gaza is an interesting one because Gaza, as a model, looks more like Iraq in terms of approach, because the same thing happened with Iraq in 2003. You had, I think, in the 1991 Gulf War, you had around 300 Tomahawk cruise missiles dropped in that period of however many weeks it was. In 2003, you had around 380 Tomahawk cruise missiles dropped every single day for about 4 to 5 months. So the level of destruction was massive, and the need, infrastructure especially, and demand to rebuild Iraq was massive. Now, Gaza took that to a whole new level in terms of disproportionality and kind of having a blank canvas to build from. And that's when you then start to look at, wait a minute, the war model has always been bomb, and the same kind of coalitions or associations that basically bombed would get contracts to rebuild. For the Bush administration, which I obviously profiled, the 37 elite decision makers, and then followed up who got contracts specifically as part of the rebuild, the connections were clear. Those who were Bush administration campaign donors basically received the lion's share of the contracts. Now, if you think some of the defense costs are exaggerated now, wait till you look at the exaggerated amounts of money that went through the Coalition Provisional Authority to some of these corporations, hundreds of millions at a time for things that probably, a high school senior class could do a better job at than a corporation based in, for example, North Carolina, receiving hundreds of millions of dollars to do in a climate where Bremer basically had Coalition Provision Order number 17, which basically meant that any individual company, a corporation operating in Iraq was basically not triable by law, both in Iraq and also in America. So when you had the case of Custer Battles expose all of this and it went to a US court, nothing was done. So the point I'm making here is that kind of lawless ecosystem and a blank canvas to operate with, both Gaza and Ukraine have that tenet to it. I mean, there's going to be a massive rebuilding job in Ukraine. And I don't want to kind of go down the big pharma setup, which we are starting to see more exposure of, which is the same kind of companies produce so many similar or connected pills for connected diseases as a kind of long-term repercussion of taking that particular medication. But there's definitely a connection between bombing, rebuilding, and the same kind of block firms. But we have also, to be fair, seen a democratization of this process. I don't know if you've seen the film War Dogs, but that covered the period after 2004, when the CPA was giving loads of no bid contracts to Cheney's Halliburton, which amounted to 39.5 billion at one point. After that, the Pentagon created this portal for any company to apply for and have access. And I think this is the case in Ukraine, in the aftermath of hostilities. There's a lot of appetite, and there was a lot of appetite for Gaza, albeit there was a lot of backlash as well for obvious reasons, which prevented this kind of disaster capitalism approach.
I mean, we grew up being told that Western democracies are run by elected officials accountable to voters, that governments make decisions in the interests of the public, that corporate power is constrained by democratic institutions. And then we look at what's actually happening, and even now, like a war was launched without even a vote of Congress, and consistently, policy decisions from foreign wars to climate to healthcare to migration track the interests of the wealthiest, no matter which party is in office. And I think this is the case in the US, and actually really increasingly so in the UK as well. I guess it's a bit of a tough question in a way, but do governments still exist in the West, or do corporations run the show? Or is it a situation that the corporations and governments' interests happen to align?
It's a good question. It's a lot easier to answer than some of the other ones I can say. Susan Strange wrote a book about structural power. When you're a corporation and you employ, let's say, Lockheed Martin employs 50,000 people, they might get away with tax, they might get a lion's share of contracts, but those 50,000 people they employ essentially contribute to the government through the tax that their employees basically end up paying. So when you look at corporate power as kind of a soft power, structural power by default, they naturally become a branch of government as part of that kind of power mechanism and that broader structure. When you asked me the question, or in the build up to it, I was actually thinking about the Epstein exposure. That's what kind of came fresh to mind. There was a lot of coverage on the outrage of the heinous nature of the crimes of Epstein, which obviously is a big thing and has to be deplored. But one thing that was missed was the fact that Epstein exposed these elite networks that exist transnationally. Not only do they exist transnationally, but they're so multi-layered and sophisticated and intricate, telling us that not only are there connections between finances, royalty, various layers and levels of elites and government ministers, but there's also processes of unaccountability and oversight and leaks that we should be concerned about, because that's not what our order is about. Our order is about democracy, as you noted, transparency, fair institutions, bargaining, negotiation, the broad tenets of pluralism. So when you see something like Epstein, or you look at the Iraq War as an example, and you look at this elite collusion, you realize that corporate power has always been around and has always been powerful and has always lobbied government and is a bipartisan thing, whether it's in the UK or in the US. But one of the things that we're seeing in this particular day and age is the lack of attempt to hide this or cover this up anymore. We openly now see wealth inequality. We see these elite billionaires, go from 10, 15, 20 billion net worth to all of a sudden 100 with little kind of question or broader accountability. And I think it's almost been normalized that there are corporate elites out there, and it's becoming more accepted in this rebrand. But I think in terms of accountability and governments, I definitely do always bring it back to the age of danger argument, which basically, says that we're in a period of, danger and morbid symptoms. As one order breaks down, the new order is yet to be born. We're seeing this order break down. You look at the news, you're seeing a lack of international law, you're seeing inequality, you're seeing mass injustice, and then domestically, you look at some of the kind of divides that we're seeing, our own domestic institutions, infrastructure, the rise of populism. All these are the morbid symptoms that accompany that period in between one order dying out and another order being born. And it always brings me back to the 1945 period, and before that, the interwar period, when the last main age of danger was. The difference between then and now is that after 1945, after two world wars, and generations growing through the damages and effects of it, there was an appetite for international institutions and governance to basically replace what existed as a kind of, if you like, setup of elites that were very unaccountable and unpopular after what we saw with Hitler, etc. Now, this period is different because the populism and this breakdown of order is coming at a severe disdain for international institutions. And this is what kind of concerns me in terms of what more morbid symptoms we may be projected to see.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think there would be so much to talk about in terms of also how somehow it, in a very unprecedented way, these elites that are able to, multifold their net worth sometimes overnight, as you've said, are also able to position themselves in a way that they possibly represent the underdog. So there's a very bizarre thing going on there. And I guess perhaps this is one of the morbid symptoms that you describe. You've also, in this conversation, you've described how elite networks effectively captured Western states. Obviously the implications of this are huge. Many have argued, particularly those who either believe in curbing the power of corporations, or I suppose people who are very pro-peace, that one of the arguments to make these wars and this, like, I guess what you said, essentially this elite capture unpopular, is the argument to make is, rather than spending on war, that budget or that spending should be spent on welfare within, nationally, whether that might be healthcare, whether that might mean other provisions. Now, in the context of the actual, almost decision or parts of the decision making not really being anchored by elected officials, where does power actually sit? Is it possible to create or to achieve change if elected governments aren't basically where the center of power is now?
Yeah, very interesting. Especially the way lobbying works and the way new networks emerge, or new forms of potential power emerge, and how they then get co-opted by those same kind of corporate lobbies. I mean, you look at the contractors for the arms industry that are contracted to lobby specifically for that as an industry, that's knowledge about security threats, about whatever it may be, to heighten that kind of concern. And then when something erupts, to create a consensus for war or for that intervention. You start to also see when there are alternate powers emerging, whether you look at some of the new parties in the UK, you start to see that actually this corporate sphere is very bipartisan. It will pay and fund whoever also emerges as an alternative. And I do firmly believe and see, based upon evidence, that we're losing more and more faith in democratic politics or change from the ballot box. And that's why also, as part of this morbid symptoms, you're seeing more and more boycott movements in this era led by Gen Z, this kind of need for ethics to be at the center of the corporate sphere in terms of at retail level. But there's some levels that, regardless of what you think about them, you're not going to affect as a market. And one of those, unfortunately, is the security and defense sector. And that's why I find it really interesting that there are now growing movements, especially here in the UK. For example, the BDS movement to target Elbit systems. And then when it goes to court, it gets struck out because of the Genocide Convention and how that plays out in practice. Huh. So the point I guess I'm making is that we're seeing a change. You've got a generation now that speaks to power through their wallets. Whether you look at Starbucks, you're looking at now AI, Sam Altman, and all of the kind of boycotts there because of his connection with a particular sector and what happened with ICE and all the rest of it. So I think you'll see more of that. But in terms of the sphere, I mean, it's probably going to intensify because we're also firmly embedded in a post-truth era where we don't respond to facts, figures, truths. Even though these truths are contested, we're in a period where we, respond more to sensationalism, emotion, and a lot of these kind of tactics definitely cover insecurities. I mean, you look at the sheer number. I mean, sometimes I read the comments to my own articles on some platforms, and I kind of realize, wow, people are heavily polarized in their own echo chambers. I mean, it's a very, very interesting period, to be honest, to be a part of and to navigate because we haven't seen anything like it before, especially the scope for misinformation and polarization. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. Feel free to follow up on that.
No, I think it's an important I think it's an important exploration, and actually I would say an important place to end because we have obviously a lot to talk about, and I'm sure we'll have you back on the show in the close future because there's many things that we can discuss. But thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts today, Bamo.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much. So that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.